Good evening, everyone. Welcome to J B Boda Academy, a webinar on DNO. We are in conversation with Mr. Praveen Gupta and Ms. Neelam Sharma. We have friends and colleagues who have joined not only from India, but different parts of the world. A very warm welcome to all of them. Today we have an esteemed speaker. I already took their names, Mr. Praveen Gupta and Ms. Neelam Sharma. It's an honor that they have accepted our invitation today. Thank you so much. A quick introduction for our speakers today. Mr. Praveen Gupta, after 40 years of varied and first-hand experience in 4 markets, he called it a day from the insurance industry. As a recognized thought leader, he pursues many interests and was a founding and managing director and CEO at Raheja QBE General Insurance Company Limited. He successfully put together a lean business model around specialist lines driven by the broking channel. He also was a part of the core management team and launched and built Bajaj Allianz General Insurance Company Limited. Praveen sir is Masters in Arts from St. Stephen's College, which is in Delhi. He's a chartered insurer, a fellow of both Chartered Insurance Institute, UK, and Insurance Institute of India. Along with Praveen sir, I would like to warmly welcome Ms. Neelam Sharma. Neelam has a dual UK and US qualified lawyer. She has over more than 29 years of experience in providing insurance and litigation strategic advices to insurers and their clients and on how insurance liability policies issued to professionals, directors and officers, corporate boards and financial institutions will respond to litigation and regulatory investigations. She lives and works in US, South America, Asia and Middle East and has a reputation for being able to bridge the cultural gap in international insurance and litigation regulatory issues. Now, some of the recognition, she has leading insurance and reinsurance lawyers. The years are 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017, 2016, 2015. She also has an American Bar Association Outstanding Achievement Excellence Award. She's an European DNO lawyer nomination for 2014. She has European author and co-publisher, Global Directors and Officers Desk Book, Vice Chair of ABA Professional Liability Insurance Committee 2015 to present. Commendable achievement, Neelam. Kindly note to the audience, you can raise all your questions in the chat facility. Chaitanya, my colleague, is there on the other side who will be raising these questions to both Praveen sir and Neelam, and you will hear the answers from there. Over to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, J B Boda Academy and the wonderful team. And Gautam Bhai, you've been really spearheading and ensuring that everyone keeps wearing a learning hat while the pandemic kind of freezes us from the workplaces. But thank you for this opportunity once again. I'm honored. The last session, we covered a lot, but what remained was some of the areas which we cannot ignore for too long. And that's basically, the Western world where the D&O originated and has evolved and is getting tested and assuming new shape and size and dynamism. And there can't be a better person than Neelam, who's kindly consented to be here in conversation. And having spoken most of what I had to speak the last time, which covered things like VUCA, the physics and chemistry, the two sides of the same coin, which is the pandemic and the climate change. I brought in the metaphors like black swan, the white swan, the gray rhino. We saw the case studies of 2 exceptional risk management cases like what Wimbledon did or what University of Illinois did in terms of risk management. We saw, we had a conversation, Jyoti and I, on class actions, because that's something which seems like it will never happen. But believe me, when we begin to believe it's not going to happen, it happens. So I'm going to be again probing the mind of Neelam in terms of what she believes could possibly happen. And then the evolution of our own jurisprudence, various undercurrents and forces, the external influencers, how D&O design could probably adapt to the Indian requirements. We also brought in interplay of various coverages and how D&O sits atop all of them, whatever you call it, management liability or D&O per se. It cannot be seen as a solo offering or a solution. And last but not the least was ESG. And many of you later asked me, what does ESG have to do with governance, and how does ESG fit into what D&O does. So a lot more and a bit of this will follow as we converse. So basically what I would do is get Neelam straight into the conversation, and perhaps ask you, Neelam, as to what do you think should be the takeaways of our today's conversation, so that many who attended this forum 1 of D&O, or many who could be attending it for the first time, are clear in terms of what should they be benefiting, how could they be benefiting while they hear you. Over to you.
Thank you, Praveen. Thank you, everybody, to attending, and to J B Boda for inviting me. What I'd like to do is actually set the scene and say that from the perspective of how we're actually going to be conducting this conversation is, at the end of it, I think there should be 4 takeaways. The first one is financial. How does all of this impact the pricing as far as this particular product is concerned? And this is in no particular order. Second is the underwriting, and that really is the assessment of the risk. And I think there's quite a few comments to be said about that. The third is the responsibility of the players in the industry. I think that's very important given what's happening. And I think the fourth one is really, how does this going to impact the wording as far as the D&O product is concerned? And particularly when it comes to the wording as far as India and the Indian players are concerned. Is it going to be standalone anymore? Or is it actually going to have various bits and sort of bells and whistles attached to it? So there are 4 takeaways, Praveen.
Sure, thank you. That's perfect. I think the audience would be delighted that you're covering virtually the entire sweep of the canvas. But before you proceed, I would like to again ask you how the current circumstances, whether this is social, political, environmental, provide an opportunity for liability insurance to be driven by purchasers as opposed to the suppliers. So liability has been historically something which has been sold by specialty brokers, by specialist insurers. You've seen what's happened in the US, or what continues to happen, and likewise in UK and the larger European market, and perhaps some other more developed markets. So how is it all changing, and what has led to this transformation? How do you see the Indian market follow the suit on these lines?
Okay, so there's 2 questions there. One is, what has led to this? And then secondly, how is this going to impact the Indian market? So let me take the first one. So what has led to this? So let me just give you a very brief summary synopsis of the D&O product outside of India. Now, it's been in the market in the US, and they always say this whenever America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Not sure whether that really is the case these days, but the fact is that the D&O product and the financial lines product itself, the whole management liability perspective, started off in the US. And what we have had is we've had a number of D&O cycles where the product was very much a very simple product to protect the directors and officers, and then it started responding to the various scandals, the corporate scandals that we've had. And we've had a number of D&O cycles which have been hard and soft cycles. And when I say hard cycles, the brokers, the underwriters amongst you will understand that that will mean that the pricing has become quite competitive, and you can do whatever you want with the wording, but it's a soft cycle. Now, the last time we had a hard cycle was in the early 2000s. And the Financial Times, what it was basically saying, and I'm going to quote to you, is that industry experts say that prices for some types of cover are doubling. Prices are rising across the board after several years of price decreases, and the cover that companies buy to protect senior management, D&O insurance, are doubling. Now, why is that? Well, I think that has a lot to do with the jury awards in the US. We also have group actions in the UK now, litigation funding, and I think you're seeing some of that in India as well. There's less capacity in the market, particularly in the UK and the US, and that's because people got their fingers burnt as a result of the subprime mortgage crisis, the financial crisis. And I think the fact that there's a greater awareness of the product. So that's led us to where we are now. Now, how do I see that impacting India? Well, I think there's 4 issues there. One is, I think that the purchasers themselves have a much more greater awareness of product. Now, my very first D&O case in India was in 1990. And since then, particularly I would say the last 5 years that I've been spending my time coming to India 4 or 5 times a year to give training on this product, to talk about litigation, to talk about how boards can be much more made aware, I've realized that the board members, the companies, are no longer just talking about what is the cheapest product you can give me for the price. They want to understand the product. They want to understand what it is that they're buying, particularly because a number of these companies are now becoming a lot more international in nature. So I think there's a greater awareness of the product by the purchasers themselves. Secondly, you have much more litigation in India. You had your Companies Act, which obviously got changed as a result of Satyam, which was one of the cases that I was working on. That I think has changed the whole corporate nature of everything. You have the internationalization of the capacity. And what I mean by that is that your insurers in India, they provide so much of a limit, but the companies need more because they are operating outside. So they're now having to work with insurers, brokers outside of India, which therefore again then lends to much more of a greater learning curve. And I think finally, which is very, very important, we should never forget this, Praveen, is we always think about it from the placement side. We ought to be thinking about it from the claims handling side, because when you get more claims, you get a greater awareness of the product. And I think those are the 4 areas where things are going to change in India. And already I've seen them changing. I mean, I'm talking to you from the experience of my Indian clients.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's fascinating, as to how multiple fronts are opening up and evolving. But before I ask you, what are the areas what areas are impacted by these developments? I just want to flag something which I mentioned in my opening remark as well, and that's ESG. It's still a new concept here. While people are still struggling to deal with ESG, the first time our current Prime Minister won the elections for his party, it was all on the platform on the slogan of governance. And that was still a new phrase or metaphor or whatever you call it for most people in day-to-day lives, and in fact in many in the businesses. But ESG is certainly more complex. And after the last session, the Q&A, a lot of people ask these questions as to what does ESG have to do with D&O. So I'm just flagging it because there is a lot of movement which is going to impact the play of D&O in this market. So please do bring that into play, whether it's employees or whatever else that get impacted or are going to push the dynamics of D&O in this marketplace. But I'd love to hear from you, and so would be the audience, as to how and when will all that kind of blow into something significant here.
Yeah. Okay. So ESG, environmental, societal governance, is very much one and the same thing as CSR, corporate social responsibility. And we've had a whole industry here in the US and in the UK and in Europe grow up around what is corporate social responsibility. And I think before the pandemic, not I think, but I know before the pandemic, there were all these corporations which were saying that they were giving mouth to it, but they weren't actually acting it. Mm-hmm. And going forward, I do believe that the corporate social responsibility, or the ESG, is going to be impacted, or should be impacted, in a much more significant way. And there are 3 areas that I've identified. The first one is, I believe that the executives doing the right thing. Now, Jamie Dimon, some of you may know, he's the chairman, chief executive of JP Morgan. And he said a quote the other day. He said that this should give us an opportunity to build a better and more substantive and sustainable world. Now, it's all the cynics amongst you, of which I'm one of them, will say it's all very good to actually say that when you've got a very big reserve in the bank account and you don't, you can play around with the money. There's a lot of companies out there that cannot play around with money. They're down to their last bit. But the companies that are surviving right now, and not just as a result of the pandemic, but just generally, and are those companies that have always looked after their employees, that have always looked after their customers, and they've looked after it from the perspective of a long-term profit as opposed to short-term profit. And you've seen that with this pandemic, with COVID. You've seen those companies which have literally just let go of their employees very quickly, those who've basically told customers that they're not going to refund the monies, etc. They did Grant Thornton did a report just a couple of days ago. I was reading about it in preparation for this today. And what they were saying was that there were companies certain industries which have really looked after their employees and their customers, and those are supermarkets. But then you look at other companies like aviation, automation, you look at industry, engineering. They not necessarily have actually looked after their employees. They've thought about what is their long-term profits. So I think going forward, executives have to be thinking about what they're doing and whether they're doing the right thing. Now, what does that mean, Neelam? Okay, so I think it means looking after your customers, looking after your suppliers, looking after your employees, and looking after your investors. Investors want to be able to invest in a company that they believe is a long-term bet. So a long-term bet, look at even Warren Buffett. He got it wrong with the aviation industry. He had to sell his shares immediately. So where does that come in? Well, that, I think, when you look at a long-term bet, that comes into how is the corporation itself as a whole being looked after. So suppliers, are they actually, the Modern Slavery Act, which we have in the UK and in Europe, are the suppliers doing the right thing when it comes to where they are actually getting their sources from? Employees, health and safety. There's a lot of companies here which have been told that they should open up, but they're refusing to open up because they're afraid of lawsuits. They're afraid of their employees suing them. And the customers themselves are afraid of actually going in to the particular organizations to work into their offices. So again, I think that's the social environment, the corporate and the governance. The second area is the risk versus crisis. Boards are very good at, or should be very good at, identifying what their risk is. As a lawyer, on a day-to-day basis, my job is assessing what the risk is, assessing what the exposure is, and providing a solution to that. Nobody could have assessed this risk of the COVID. Nobody. But you know what they could have done? They could have assessed and managed the crisis. Absolutely. Now, when you look at the D&O product, the financial lines product, there is a section in there, which is normally a sublimit of $25,000 for crisis management. And there are separate policies for crisis management, risk insurance policies, but they're not very, very effective. So I just wonder whether going forward, that's something which could be done differently as well. Boards could be thinking about not just the risk, but how are they going to be responding to the crisis? There was a report out the other day which said by 2080, European countries will be very severely affected by mosquito-borne diseases. Wow. The reason being is that the temperature is going to rise. Now, are we going to be impacted by that as a society? Probably. Yeah. Are we going to be impacted by that as an industry? Absolutely. So be prepared for the crisis. And I think the final area is going to be how this is going to, from the corporate social governance, it's not just about the corporate social governance of a company, it's about the industry that serves it. And then in this case, I think it's the regulators. There's going to be, if you think about the whole environment, working environment has completely changed. Trading opened again on the New York Stock Exchange yesterday, 100 people, that's nothing. Most trading is probably now going to be done from home. Yeah. People are going to be working from home. So how do you regulate your employees? How do you regulate the trading? So there's going to be there's going to be impact on financial regulation, impact, I think, on IT regulation, and impact on the whole cyber. So I think it's those three areas, the executives doing the right thing, the risk versus the crisis, and the regulation. That's the whole, for me, how corporate society, CSR/ESG is all about. And just from the crisis perspective, Praveen, linking it back to the climate, when you think about a crisis, this COVID is potentially about the climate. What would happen maybe 2080? Potentially all about the climate. Yeah. And when you have what happened in, I think you've got a Bhopal #2 on your Andhra Pradesh, I think it was, exactly. With the Korean company, yeah. You know, they've got an engineering company there. They didn't take into account how their employees were working in India They were doing it from the perspective of how they would how they would work at it from Korea. So that's like that. The crisis is about managing your crisis in respect of all of your cultures, not just what you yourself believe in.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think that's a very important area to be sensitized and accepted. So are you saying, Neelam, that the employee is emerging as the most important stakeholder? And if so, how does it impact not just D&O, but the entire liability suite of offerings?
Yeah, I think employees for a short term will become the most important stakeholder in the corporation. Once the company has got back up and running again, then I think the boards will start taking back some kind of control, unless they're obviously unionized, in which case that's probably a very, very different story. But when you're looking at the private companies, I agree, the employees are going to be because they're the ones that are going to produce the products, you know, when you think about the industries. But ultimately, once the next couple of years have passed and I think we've calmed down and we've actually learned all the lessons, then when you look at from the liability perspective, where do I think and how do I think there's going to be an impact? And again, I'm learning the lessons from what I've done in the US and what's happened in the UK and in Europe. And again, just to backtrack, when I came back, I worked in the US for a very long time, and then I came back to the UK to build up an international book of business. Do you know, financial lines here, people hardly knew about it. There was a lot of thinking, a lot of training that needs to be done. So that is where I think my experience comes from. So the impact, so how I think it's going to be impacted going forward, and not just the whole COVID, but just generally the development of the product going forward, and how I think will also be impacted in India is the underwriters' training of the risk management, and the brokers' training, because if you're going to have the product being delivered or being driven by the purchasers and not by the suppliers anymore, then the underwriters and the brokers and we as lawyers also need to understand what our purchasers are looking for. And it's no longer just, here's a product off the shelf, take it and try and adapt to it. It's going to be, this is what I want. You now construct a policy wording for me, which fits around those needs. So that, I think, in turn is going to require us to train our underwriters and train our brokers and our lawyers that service the industry in that particular way. When it comes to the policies themselves, I think there's going to be a very definite change in the definition of claim, because claim at the moment defines, is very, very regimental. And I think if you're looking at it from a CSR perspective, it's probably going to become a bit more softer and a bit more sort of like, I suppose, touchy-feely. What are your exclusions going to be? Are we going to be excluding class actions? I mean, you've now got a class action under the Companies Act. You actually had the class actions already. It's just now been codified in law. So you need to assess what the risk is going to be. And for a while, and I'll give you an example with the bribery, in D&O policies, we specifically excluded bribery. And it was only because when it became common that we realized that our companies needed it, that we then started to underwrite it in and provide it with a risk. But we actually did a very good, I suppose, actuarial assessment around it. Are we going to increase the SIR? Because so then people can then have a lot more control over their insurances. Bankruptcies are being delayed. Does that mean that we're going to have to change the definition of wrongful trading? Because obviously wrongful trading at the moment is codified in law, certainly in the US and in the UK. And I know I was reading the Indian Times as well, and you've got a very similar law, similar potential proposal in India as well for the bankruptcies to be delayed. And then the pricing. I think the pricing is going to be increased because the product itself is going to become a lot more complicated.
Great. So I'll come back to some of the things that you just touched upon. But one thing that I'll certainly want you to respond to is the state of independent directors. You know, you know, there was always a room for independent directors, but that too had to be codified. And the Companies Act 2013 brought in the formalization. But increasingly, one, I would say, stakeholder in our play who's reacted negatively is the independent director. We've seen a significant exodus of independent directors who realize that their responsibilities and liabilities are too onerous and they don't want to continue given all kinds of triggers that have been going on, and there's no way they can really manage or understand the full spectrum of risks in play, and they could get involved into it for no fault of theirs. And this work from home and all that distances them from the workplace even more. The line of delineation, while it should have thinned, has kind of become more deeper or broader for the independent director who's serious, conscientious. What really happens? How do you deal with this vulnerability? You want governance, you have to have independent directors. So in what ways can a D&O assure them and make them perform to the levels that would help not just the governance but the ESG play into place?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to address that question in a very different way, Praveen, if I may.
Yep.
First of all, when it comes to the UK and the US, if you are going to be an independent director, it is mandatory that the company that you're going to be the independent director of gives you directors and officers insurance. Okay, we had that codified in law. So that's number one. Number two, as far as the independent director's liability is concerned, it shouldn't be seen as something that you're just giving away. It should have a lot more thought process to it. If the independent director felt that the company was taking their role seriously, and secondly, that the insurers would take the role of independent directors seriously and providing this serious product, not just an add-on, then that would be another step in the right direction. And the third thing, and the reason why I wanted to look at it from a different perspective, is that I think it's in order for the directors and officers, for the individual directors to feel that they're going to be A, independent, and B, that they're going to have the confidence, is that they need to work with their company and with the insurers closely. And that means having a contract in place which sets out exactly what their remit is, exactly what it is that they're going to be doing, what they're going to be overseeing, and more importantly, when I draft independent directors' contracts, identifying what they are not going to be responsible for. Now, as a lawyer, when I send out my engagement letters, what I'm doing is not as important as that section B that I put in of I will not be advising you on. Okay. And I make that very, very clear. So therefore, you've then excluded that liability. And you've got to be very careful that every time somebody asks you to do something which touches upon that, you go back and say, I'm not being retained to do that. And that's how the independent director, so they can help themselves by making sure that the contract that is put in place is very seriously negotiated, because that will then allow them to limit their risk. And when they know that their risk is being limited to the nth degree, they can then make sure that they get a policy which is bespoke, which is tailor-made for them. And the underwriters should be looking at the IDL in a very different way to the D&O for the corporate and for the full-time boards. Has that answered your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. But what kind of amazes me as some of the developments, I'm just as an observation, you may wish to react to that as well. Like Elon Musk recently, for Tesla and the rest of his businesses, decided to do away with the D&O, and because he believes that the price is not reasonable. I mean, has the pricing just blown out of proportion? There is one question. But two is, he has assured his directors that don't worry, I will look after your liabilities from my personal wealth. So does this sound out of line, or is it something which is Elonish, or is it very American, or is it what?
Well, look, I from a personal perspective, it's probably a reaction to wanting to preserve he's an outlier in that sense. But I think the way that you would look at it is that if I was a director of that corporation, of any corporation which was doing away with any form of liability insurance, I'd want to make sure that there was something else there in my contract that I was going to be covered by the company.
Yeah.
And then I want to make sure that the company had enough money to cover me as well, that they were solvent. So therefore, I want to make sure there was a letter of guarantee or some kind of credit behind it. So I think it's very easy to say something like that, but as a director, as an officer, who's going to want to serve on the board of any organization that doesn't have security in place? Because we all make mistakes. Yeah. We are just human, and particularly when you're doing deals left, right, and center, you know, mistakes are going to be made, and that is what the insurance is there for something that was not foreseeable, but you know, you had no idea that it was actually going to be sort of something that would then actually come to fruition. So it's like companies include their SIR, the self-insured retention. They're doing it to try and take back control, quote unquote. So that may have something to do with it. But in answer to your question, if I was a director and officer of that organization, of any such organization, I'd want to make sure that there was a backup in play.
Wonderful. No, thanks. That should be a more, I would say, a prudent approach for an independent director wondering what to do. But at this point of time, I want to steer away a bit and get into the area of business interruption. We've seen all kinds of controversies in both your markets, where there is also a political action pushing the insurance industry to get its act right in political sense. So, in this market, business interruption was always taken very lightly. It's only now that people are waking up to this realization, and there's a strong urge to move beyond not just, you know, doing the BI right, but also beyond the realm of what you call the material damage. So what are your thoughts on that?
So business interruption has always been around. It's a very solid policy.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a standalone policy. Sometimes it's part and parcel of a whole set of liability insurances. And COVID-19, I've been kept very, very busy with trying to advise on business interruption policies, very much on I suppose sort of trying to just give a very high level, light touch overview. And the business interruption policy is probably, there's 4 areas. It's only responsive if there's physical damage. 2, if there is a local authority or a government decision. 4, what is a notifiable disease? And 5, then 4, then what is the calculation of the loss? And the calculation of the loss is how have you actually lost your profits? And I think what's been recognized, and I was just turning to an article in the Financial Times yesterday about this, that it highlights the clear need for insurers to support the policyholders. And what it was saying was that the business interruption policy has been identified as not being fit for purpose. Okay, now from the underwriters and the insurers in the audience, they will say, Neelam, the business interruption policy was never ever there for something like COVID-19. It's you have to have a physical damage, and from that physical damage, you then have to have a potential loss arising from that physical damage, which stops you from trading, etc. The issue is that companies have added in, because we had such a soft market for such a long time, they've added in bells and whistles, and they've added in what is a notifiable disease. And because COVID-19, which was never foreseen, is not listed in the notifiable diseases, it's obviously excluded as a loss, together with the fact that it wasn't a local government or a government decision within 25 miles of the radius of the particular door of the particular corporation, etc. So you're trying to put around a square hole, a square policy into a round hole. It just doesn't work as much as you try and put it into it. So that's why I think a lot of these commentaries are talking about looking at it from the moral, ethical perspective, and that again links in to what we were talking about, the corporate social governance, the insurers looking after. So the short answer to your question is that the business interruption policy is not fit for purpose for this type of particular notification, but the question is, should it be going forward? And that again, I think, needs to have a very long, hard look, because I don't think there's enough income in the reserves for all the claims to be paid out.
So wonderful, but what really happens to the boards, and they get squashed between what the governments and the political undercurrents have to say, what the regulators expect. what the clients thought could also be covered, what the brokers want to do. And, you know, at the end of the day, you have a hole in your balance sheet. And what happens to my fiduciary responsibilities? You know, someone's going to sue me, and there could be, if there's a big hole, I could get class actions clamoring over me. So what happens there?
Yeah. Okay. So you're asking a very holistic question.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you're servicing the insurance industry, you have to think about these scenarios all the time from an actuarial perspective. And the fact is, Praveen, there comes a point in time when you cannot provide for a risk. You cannot underwrite that type of risk at all. All you can do is you can look at what are the actual things that are happening. And what will happen is the business interruption policy may not respond. What will happen is that the regulators, certainly here in the UK, we've got the FSA, the FCA, taking 3 or 4 policies to court in the next 6 months. I think it's going to be heard probably by July, August of this year, to test the policies as to whether they will respond or not. So people are waiting for that decision. You've got brokers clamoring around to see whether they can actually change the policy wording. You've got the premiums increased going forward as to potential losses. But there's got to be a point in time when you've got to say, stop. Enough. I cannot underwrite this risk. This is the best that I can do. Yes, you may get a class action, but how likely is that class action as far as your industry is concerned, as far as your consumer belt is concerned, as far as your employees are concerned? So it does come at a time when you just cannot underwrite the risk. That's my answer to that holistic question.
Yeah, so that's wonderful, because you see, there has to be a business sense also. You can't kill the insurance industry. I mean, to tell you, I mean, I can't be more candid in saying that. But the point is, if it were to go to that extreme, where the government and political view prevails, could that become kind of a trigger for becoming a precedent in other markets, even like India?
It depends upon how strong your government can impose a law, absolutely. In the same way that our government has imposed various, you know, laws as far as when it comes to our statute and our legislation, and obviously we have the common law as well. We have our cases which set out what the precedents are. But ultimately, the government can say what they want. They're not the ones who are then going to have to pay out on those particular claims. And so there has been a lot of talk here in the UK and in the US. And remember, in the US, the insurance industry is regulated state by state.
Yes, exactly.
We have a number of states which have very, very different ways of actually looking at these insurance issues. And if the government are going to say, you insurers have to pay out, then insurers are going to say, well, you government are going to have to underwrite my risk because I haven't got the money to pay out for this. You know, and am I too big to fail? So it becomes a bit of a circular argument. Okay. And so that's where I think that the conversation, there comes a time when the roundabout has to stop. And that for me is, it may sound very black and white, but you've got to look at it from a very business, commercial, practical perspective. And that's why I think from the holistic approach, it just doesn't work from an underwriting perspective.
So it looks like we are into a kind of a long-term, whatever you call it, you know, time into the boxing ring, where things may just not conclude all that easily, or, you know, that decisively. So we need to see what comes out of it. But coming to yet beyond the D&O and the likes and the business interruption, what else can this pandemic trigger, which is still probably a blind spot or not being anticipated, or what we ought to know in these markets here?
Yeah, I think so. From a product perspective, I think that there's the trade credit insurance policies, which also I've been looking at, and they, you know, you've got suppliers who are just not paying simply because they cannot afford to pay, because their customers have not paid them, and that again, there's a lot of the policy wordings themselves. For those of you who do trade credit insurance out there, that is very, very complicated insurances. So there's the issue there as to what can we be doing to make those trade credit insurance policies probably simpler going forward. I think there's going to be a new product out there standalone for a crisis management / brand reputation management insurance policy. I think there's going to be more emphasis on employment protection, so for health and safety perspective. And again, there's going to have to be much more of an interaction with the regulators. And I think on the supply chain, again, I mentioned the Modern Slavery Act. I think we're going to be having to look at, are there insurances, liability insurance, that we can be putting in place to protect the suppliers going forward? Because if you protect your suppliers, you then are going to protect the consumers, and you are then going to protect the industry as a whole.
Okay, so we covered what basically buyers are looking at, but the specialty space has generally been dominated by intermediaries, but not just the intermediaries, brokers and other specialist agents or whoever. What is it that you would expect in terms of servicing this continuum? Would you please highlight the key responsibilities of those servicing this space in the insurance liability space?
Yeah. So again, looking at it from the perspective of the UK, US and Europe, the responsibilities of the suppliers, of those who actually service the industry, is quite an actually vast space. And I would break it into three categories. I'd break it into individuals like myself who are lawyers, so who service the insurers and service the policyholders. Now, I'm a litigator, so I go into court and I assess the risk and the exposure of going into court. And I always say to my clients that if I end up having to go into court, then I failed, because I don't want to actually go into court and get the decision made by a judge, because the fact is that my witness could fail on that particular day. The other side may come up with some disclosure which I wasn't aware of. I want to be able to make a decision based upon the facts that I have control over. Going into court, you never have control. So a couple of things that have happened recently. One, there's been quite a bit of commentary in the papers about all these potential lawsuits. Don't go to court. Try and avoid them by having a negotiated mediation disputes. Secondly, when you do mediate, when you do negotiate, don't just look at the wording, don't just look at the contractual element, look at it from a moral and an ethical and a social impact. That's what they're saying about these insurers. They've got to look after their policyholders, not just from the contractual perspective, but also from a social, moral perspective. And I think lawyers can do that as well. We can stop being so difficult in our analysis and probably just be a lot more recognize what our social responsibilities are. It's easier said than done, because we've all got to make money. Got to think about it from that perspective, but it is something to actually think about. Number two, I said this at the very, very beginning. We didn't have this before, but we do have this now with the UK. Is that the UK and the US is that the underwriting and the claims department used to be very, very separate. You know this, Praveen, because you come from that environment. The underwriter was the church and the claims were the state, and the two would never, ever mix. No. Now, a good insurer is somebody who, when they go out to place a risk, they don't just take their underwriter with them. They take the broker, because obviously the broker is always going to be there, but they always take the claims handler, and they take their top claims handler, because individuals don't want to just know that they've got a good product. They want to know that when things go wrong, they've got somebody really good to be able to handle it. So I think underwriters and claims need to work together. That then allows the underwriters to be much more aware of what the wordings are, what the development in the wordings are going forward. And I think on the third aspect is we need to be looking at it from how we ourselves are educating ourselves as to our corporations and to our purchasers. Are we actually listening to them, or are we just telling them, this is what the product is, this is what it does, take it or leave it?
Wonderful. So I think we can go on, but we should leave some room for the Q&A, and I'm sure there are lots of people wanting to know a lot more than what we could cover in these 45 minutes. And before we kickstart that, I need to provoke you on something. You are a litigator, you deal with your courts, and I'm sure the pandemic stops you from going to the court, and you would be working from home, a camera looking at you all the time. How has that changed your life?
It's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. I did a 14-hour mediation a couple of weeks ago. 14 hours. It was on camera. And
Right.
anytime I needed to go to the loo or eat something or something, you literally just had to step away and we had 70 participants on the actual camera. Yes, every single day I'm in court, and I'm in court for 2 to 3 hours. Sometimes I'm in court for about 7 hours. So there's some good things and some bad things. The good things is that you are very succinct. You are very very focused in your arguments. No BS around. You can't sort of like deal with all the white noise. You just have to get to the point. The bad thing is that you don't see people's, you have to, when you're negotiating, you need to see the other person's face.
Exactly.
You need to know what their body language is. It's a lot more about emotional intelligence, and you just cannot do that on the camera. People have some excellent poker faces. So that is one thing which you'll just, even myself, when I'm hearing my opponent's argument, if I'm in court, they cannot see how I'm responding, but on camera, they can see absolutely everything. And the other thing I've learned, and as women out there, you will understand, you need good makeup. Simple as.
So I'm sure you're learning new tricks. But with that, I think, thank you, Neelam. I think let's open up the Q&A session. So Chaitanya, Vera, you please come and help us with it.
Sure, definitely. We've got some wonderful comments coming in from all over the world. Just a couple of important questions that I have for Neelam.
Yeah.
You just touched upon the part that, with US, there being different states. And from a legal perspective, how difficult is it to manage things from a legal perspective across the states in the US especially?
Okay, so I'm California qualified. So I'm aware of what happens in California in my field of law. When it comes to managing any other states, so if I go to court in New York, I can be admitted in New York under what is known as pro hoc vice. So I get a license just for that particular case to be able to go to the actual court. But as far as it's the specific question, Chetan, so to manage it, you have to employ lawyers from that particular state to be able to answer the question, because I will not know the answer to 52, 53 sets of states law. So that's how you manage it. You always work with other lawyers, and it becomes very, very expensive and time consuming.
Part two of the question, in UK now with Brexit being there, given the current context, how do you blend the legal perspective? How does that feature?
How do I blend what perspective? Brexit with...
In a sense, Brexit along with, the claims that will be coming as far as DNO is concerned. Given
I see.
there
As
is a
far
lot
as,
happening
okay, yeah, so, the fact that we've left the European Union and we don't have the passport, etc.
The European.
Okay. So prior to Brexit, we were able to advise all of our European clients from the claims handling perspective, because we had what was known as the passport harmonization regime. At the moment, that is still very much in place. So we don't know whether that is now going to be absolutely taken away from us. And if that's the case, then we're just going to have to revert to what we do in the US, that we're just going to have to hire lawyers in those particular jurisdictions to be able to manage those particular claims. So the answer to the question is that there is no clear answer at the moment. Right now, we're just carrying on as normal. So if a claim comes in from Italy, from France, from Sweden, and it's underwritten in the UK, subject to UK law, then it's dealt with by, whether it's dealt by Lloyd's or dealt with by UK lawyers within the UK jurisprudence. So we're just dealing with it as normal right now. So at the moment, no impact.
The earlier webinar that we did, Praveen sir had touched upon ESG and corporate social responsibility as well as corporate governance in the Indian context. Would you like to touch upon it as far as the UK and the US context is concerned?
In what way? Because we've talked about ESG and CSR. We are, I guess, we have it. We have a number of commentaries in place in the US and the UK, which make it, in fact, actually what I'll do is I'm going to read out to you something from the Financial Times. And what it makes, this probably answers the question actually. So in the pre-COVID world, there was always some pressure to become better, more responsible corporate citizens. But now with many of the world cities in lockdown, etc., the focus now is on long-term sustainability goals. So what the Financial Times was basically saying, and other commentaries are basically saying, is that this now, corporate social responsibility, should become a much more important way of thinking. It shouldn't be something that you think about at the end of the dinner party. It should be the focus of the dinner party discussion. So I don't know if that's answered the question, because we've spoken a lot about ESG and CSR, but it is much more of a focal point now than it was, I would say, before.
You spoke about Satyam and, in the Indian context, in terms of how we actually woke up to the possibility of, and the aspect of having a DNO policy in place. Because prior to Satyam, DNO was probably one of the policies which was good to have. But now it's more, post 2009, it's been more of the must-have policies.
Yeah.
So in the Indian context, how has your experience been in the past 1 decade post Satyam?
Yeah, okay. So you are absolutely right, Jathan, and whoever asked that question, that's an excellent question. Yes, when I used to do DNO from 1990 through to probably about sort of 2009, 2010 in India, it was hard. I was going to India and people had no idea what I was talking about. Or if they did, it was just like, yeah, well, sort of never. And, Bessa, how much is it going to cost me, etc. And then you had Satyam, and then you had a lot of the other scandals in India. You literally, need to pick up the paper. And very recently, obviously, the diamond scandal, Modi, and obviously you've had a lot of other corporate scandals. And they reminisce because it's not just about India anymore, because those corporations are worldwide. All right. So you've got class actions. Satyam was a class action in the US as well, and in Canada. All right. And so definitely it became much more of awakening that it's now a must need. But in the last decade, it's gone from an understanding that, yes, we need it, but we don't want to pay for it, to now we need it. And it's now much more of a central tenement in order to be able to get A, good directors, and B, to allow us to build our company in such a way that it's much more sustainable from the perspective of internationally, because they want to compete internationally. And when you've got the geos of this world and they've got more investment from international perspective than they have internally, domestically, then because externally the directors will not operate without a decent DNO policy, of course it's going to raise the bar. So I think that what I've learned is that over the last 10 years, and I'm sure some of you who've obviously worked with me over the last 10 years will also see that, is that the product has become much more sophisticated and people's understanding of it has become much more sophisticated. And that can only be a good thing. I'll give you an example. I'm no longer going into boards and answering the question of what is DNO. I'm now going into boards and the question is, Neelam, tell me not how this product works for me, but tell me what is it that I can be doing now to make sure that the DNO product is something that is going to respond. It's much more intelligent, much more focused questions.
The last session we had heard from you, Praveen sir, about the global pandemic, being a black swan or a grey rhino.
No, I said it's not a black swan, it was a grey rhino. Yep.
You said it was a grey rhino. So
yep.
Would you like to elaborate more on that? Because we've gone.
Well, the way I just mentioned that, we talked about the metaphors. Basically, black swan is something that is a surprise. It's an unknown. Whereas a grey rhino is something that you see coming in your direction, yet you look the other way around. And it can cause huge damage. So the pandemic was nothing but a grey rhino. People saw it coming, but we were ignoring it. Bill Gates, of course, he's one of the best known personalities in the world. In 2015, he stood up and gave a TED talk and talked about something coming, almost defining what was coming. And yet we chose to ignore it. The UK government knew it. The CIA knew it. So you can't blame it can't be attributing it as a black swan. Even Nassim Taleb, who coined it, said it's not a black swan, it's a white swan. We saw it coming. So, the point is, I see Indian financial analysts, fooling around with their naive customers, as I say, or sometimes they themselves are too naive and they keep alluding to pandemic as a black swan, which it is not. So I'm sorry, it's a gross misuse of phraseology. It's become a cliche and misused.
This question is for Neelam, basically related to the US and UK perspective. From an investment perspective, are the DNO policies mandatory from a cultural standpoint? Or are we still seeing people onboarding as directors without a DNO?
Yeah. Okay. So this is where there is a difference. In the US, certain states do make it mandatory. Don't ask me off the top of my head, but there's certain states which do make it mandatory. In the UK, as a result of the Higgins report, it became mandatory for non-executive directors, for independent directors, and now as a result of the Cadbury's report, it's now become mandatory for directors and officers to have insurance in place. So yes, it is now a mandatory perspective. It's not something which is culture, but it's a very interesting way of looking at this, because if it becomes mandatory, which it has done, it automatically becomes part of the culture. So now you're not going to have a director or officer. I certainly am not going to become a NED, a non-executive director, unless I know there's some form of insurance in place for me. Yeah.
We'd like to hear from you in terms of, post Satyam in the Indian sub-context. Are we looking at DNO more as a risk transfer mechanism and a must-have, or how have things changed post Satyam, 2009 to now, 2020?
Okay, well, just going back to the fact that customers, I think purchasers are just much more aware of what the product is. I don't think it's become a must-have yet. I think there still needs to be, as I was talking to Praveen, I think it's there's still a lot more understanding and a lot more awareness and education that needs to be had as to exactly what the product is. But we are getting there. And particularly when you become much more of an international, those companies which are international, I think the challenge in the Indian market is those companies which want to become international, recognizing they're going to need to have DNO in place. Those companies which are domestic but are not yet international, they may still see it as something which is not important for them. And the challenge is that potentially going forward from a corporate social governance perspective, if they do want to compete with the other domestic players and make themselves bigger and better and stronger, then the only way they're going to need to do that is by actually getting good people on board, and good people on board are not going to do it without some form of risk to be able to allow their risk to be managed. In answer to your question as to whether it's a risk transfer, no. A DNO policy is not a risk transfer policy, and I'll tell you why. DNO policy has a limit which is all-inclusive as far as legal expenses is concerned. A negligence policy has a limit, and then it has expenses in addition. Here, the majority of the defence costs are what are going to be used in order to be able to eat up that particular limit. So it's not a risk transfer. It's allowing you to pay your defence costs to allow you to defend yourself in respect of a wrongful action against you.
I think we've taken most of the relevant questions here. So thank you very much, Praveen sir and Neelam.
Chetan, there's another tiny question attached to the same question, the following to that.
Yeah, we'll just take this before we hand it over to Aruna. From a claim point of view, do you foresee more claim litigation in India? Because traditionally, commercial litigation is not very common. So what's your...
Okay, so you know what? The way that actually works is by the lawyers, honestly, because class action lawyers, they travel all over the world. Litigation funding travels all over the world. And if they see a claim, they will, and they feel that there is the ability there, then they will make that claim. You know, India has a very social, ethical, moral way of doing things. And they may decide that their neighbor has wronged them, but they decide not to do anything about it. In the UK, in the US, in Europe, if somebody has wronged us, that's it. We'll go after them, left, right, and center. It's a very different cultural way of thinking. I think that in answer to the question, it's going to be very much dependent upon your regulators, if they're going to allow for litigation funding. I think it's also going to very much depend upon how your lawyers actually work going forward from a litigation perspective. And I think it's also that once the boards, from a DNO perspective, from a financial lines perspective, recognize exactly what their risks are, if they want to be prevented to be sued, they'll make sure that those risks are managed. If, however, they're not afraid of being sued, then litigation is going to come in from the outside. It's going to come in from externally. So the answer to your question is that it's very much dependent upon a number of factors. But if you get the litigation funding right, you get the lawyers on board, you get a greater understanding of what your exposures are going to be, the awards for your cases are going to be higher. At the moment, you have hardly any awards for your claims for people who have been impacted. Then if that's the case, then yes, that will increase your claims. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Neelam. Thank you, Praveen, sir. Aruna, over to you, please.
Thank you, Chaitanya. Thank you, Neelam, ma'am. Thank you, Praveen, sir. On this note, I would like to call Gautam, sir, to convey the vote of thanks, and we'll do the closure later on.
Thank you, Aruna. Good evening, everyone, once again. On behalf of J B Boda Group and the audience, we are delighted and humbled with the presence of Mr. Praveen Gupta and Ms. Neelam Sharma as speakers of the day. We are truly appreciate the valuable information you both have shared with us today on D&O, which I personally believe it was very important, and we sincerely thank you for that. When planning an event such as this, it is imperative to gain the participation of experts in the field. We are fortunate to have both of you with us today. Your willingness to share your time and expertise in the area of D&O was critical to the success of this webinar. Once again, I would like to convey my sincere thanks to one and all for joining us today in webinar. Take care and stay safe. Over to you, Aruna. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So some of the comments that are flowing in on the chat, like we have never done this. One of the comments which I really liked is top class session. So they are saying thanks to Neelam ma'am and to you as well, Praveen sir. And they're saying one of the expert session that was organized today. So kudos to both of you, and thank you so much for coming on board with us on JB Boda Academy. Tomorrow we have the finale webinar session on parenting today. Please do join us tomorrow. Thank you so much for coming. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.